Hello, I'm Grayson Carter, and this is a short lecture on the Church in Latin America, its history. During the Age of Discovery, during the 15th to 17th century, explorers from European nations visited virtually every corner of the globe. Much of the Western Hemisphere, reached by Columbus for the first time in 1492, and soon after by others, was claimed not only for Spain or Portugal, but also for the Catholic Church. Thus, much of the Caribbean, Florida, Central and South America, and the American Southwest and West soon came under Spanish or Portuguese and Roman Catholic influence. Wherever these explorers ventured, they planted churches, leaving what now seems to us like very old churches and a Christian presence in a number of different countries. The city of Santo Domingo, for example, was founded by the Spanish in 1496. Its cathedral, Santa Maria el Menor, was established a few years later, in 1514, the oldest church in the Western Hemisphere. Spain claimed New Mexico around the year 1540. The Franciscans arrived in 1581, and the first church was established there in 1598. By 1623, just 3 years after the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers at Plymouth in Massachusetts, the Catholic Church had formed the Diocese of Durango, covering all of New Mexico and parts of northern Mexico. By this date, over 80,000 Indians had been baptized, and at least 43 churches had been established throughout the diocese. The Spanish also moved steadily up the western coast of the Americas, establishing an extensive chain of missions that ran from the tip of South America northward to Northern California, the town of Sonoma, north of San Francisco. Father Eusebio Kino, a Jesuit missionary, established 24 missions and chapels throughout northwest Mexico and Arizona between 1685 and 1711. He also became an outspoken advocate for the rights of native people against exploitation. This is Mission San Javier de Blanc, south of Tucson, which is one of the greatest of the Spanish missions planted in the New World. Many of these efforts fell victim to complex political and military matters that occurred far from the mission field, back in Europe, for example. The countries of Latin America soon grew weary of their European masters and fought and sought independence, often violently. Revolution came to Haiti in 1804, to northern Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay in 1810, to Chile and southern Argentina in 1818, to Venezuela and Colombia in 1819, to Mexico and Peru in 1821. Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica all sought their independence in 1823. In the case of Costa Rica, their independence not from Spain, but from Mexico. Brazil and Bolivia sought theirs in 1825, Ecuador in 1830, and Panama in 1903. This complex colonial history has led to considerable diversity in the history of the Church in Latin America. Virtually everywhere, Catholicism has dominated the religious scene, though in recent times, Protestantism has also become more prominent. Latin America has about 20 different countries and over 600 million people. During the colonial period, the exclusive rights of the Catholic Church were upheld by the state and ecclesiastical rule. including that of the Inquisition, which was active in the New World. One result of this was the effectual banning of Protestantism. Another was that the Catholic Church often aligned itself with the ruling oligarchy. This preserved the Church's privileged position and encouraged it to ignore or to overlook abuses, sometimes even atrocities, committed by the state. A number of official treaties, or concordats as they're officially called, were signed between the Catholic Church and the state government. These granted privileges to the Catholic Church, or designated the specific nature of its role in some aspect of the nation's life, such as its role in the military or in education. In 1862, for example, a concordat was signed between the Church and the government of El Salvador, through which the Catholic Church became the official state religion. After this time, the state supported the Church financially, including the payment of clerical salaries, and the Church could now purchase and own property, establish schools, and religious orders. It could also set up ecclesiastical courts to rule on church matters or matters of doctrine. The Church, on the other hand, was required to recognize and participate in the civil courts in temporal matters. It was expected to pray for the well-being of the state and its leaders. And the state was given some freedom to discuss the appointments of bishops. Church properties were also now subject to taxation. Quite naturally, Protestants found it difficult to gain entry or to make progress against such a regime. The purchase of property was often forbidden or made difficult, as was obtaining building permits and even conducting Protestant worship. At best, Protestants were viewed as interlopers into Catholic territories. At worst, they were heretics that were eliminated by the Inquisition. Between 1880 and 1930, there was massive and diverse European immigration into Latin America, which introduced new ideas and churches into the region. Around the same time, some religious orders were expelled from Latin America, often as a result of their members, the monks or friars, meddling in local politics. During the early 20th century, U.S. foreign policy and trade agreements favored the entry of Protestant missionaries into various regions of the Caribbean and Latin America. Some liberal governments in Latin America moved toward greater secularization, thereby denying power to the Catholic Church. As a result, the Catholic Church was placed somewhat on the defensive. According to a recent, that is a 2014 survey, 19% of the overall population of Latin America is Protestant, rising to about 40% in some countries. It's strongest in Central America. Many of its Protestants are recent converts. I use this 2014 survey because it's the most recent one I could find, but there hasn't been anyone that I know of since then. And these numbers, the percentages of overall population of Protestants in Latin America, has surely gone up, both numerically and as a percent of the overall population. Any number of Protestant denominations can be found throughout Latin America, a reflection of the former colonial period, where Protestant missionaries from Europe and the U.S. were present and active, that is, when not disallowed by the Catholic Church. Many new forms of Protestant can also be found in Latin America, including the growth of megachurches and those advancing some form of prosperity gospel. These are traditions that are imported from the U.S. and often first introduced to ordinary people by the growth of religious broadcasting, which has been very popular throughout Latin America. Especially notable has been the growth of Pentecostalism, throughout much of Latin America. Throughout the long history of Latin America, Protestantism made relatively at least, few inroads. That began to change recently. To the surprise of many, however, it was not the traditional mainline Protestant denominations that began to grow, but a relatively new and often marginalized spiritual movement, that is, Pentecostalism. So how did Pentecostalism come to Latin America? Early in its history, stretching back to the early years of the 20th century, Pentecostal missionaries began to travel throughout Latin America. Their message had great appeal to many people. There are a number of reasons for this popularity. First of all, its emphasis upon the gifts of the Spirit and on faith healing proved popular. Likewise, its appeal to the poor and the marginalized in society, who often felt ignored by the Catholic Church. While the Catholic and Protestant churches were largely controlled by well-educated elites, even in many cases by European priests and by American missionaries, Pentecostalism moved quickly to train and empower local leadership. While Catholic and Protestant churches appealed to the small middle classes, Pentecostalism fell among the fertile soil of the working or laboring classes and peasantry. To many of them, Pentecostalism appeared like a way to be healed of illness, addiction, or substance abuse, to gain education, and to climb out of poverty and hopelessness. And so it's proved. In time, as Pentecostalism has begun to gain respectability, it began to appeal to those higher up in Latin American society. And today it's composed of people drawn from both the working and the middle classes. Part of this appeal can be found in the form of the prosperity gospel, advanced by some Pentecostal churches. Intentionally active in missionary and evangelistic work as well, at first in local areas, but soon in other parts of Latin America and further afield. Unlike the Catholic Church, Pentecostalism has avoided the influence of liberation theology, though in some countries, specifically in Brazil, Chile, and Guatemala, its members have increasingly begun to exercise their political muscle regarding various social and religious issues. Overall, however, this has not detracted Pentecostalism from remaining focused on its spiritual mission. Finally, Pentecostalism has been successful because it's focused on speaking to the needs, spiritual and otherwise, of local, ordinary people. It healed the sick, fed the hungry, educated the ignorant, helped break the bonds of addiction, and offered hope not just to the life to come, but also for this life. That is, in theological terms, Pentecostalism emphasized both the future and a realized eschatology. Each of these factors has led to dynamic growth in Pentecostalism in Latin America, especially since the 1960s. Exact numbers are hard to find, but conservatively, approximately 15% of the population of Latin America would now identify with Pentecostalism, or around 90 million people. Since the expulsion of the Jesuits by the King of Spain in 1767, Mexico has experienced considerable religious unrest and turmoil. In part, this was due to the influence of the Jesuits in Mexican society and the respect in which they were held by ordinary people. That is to say, nature hates a void, and after the Jesuits were expelled, there was a great void in which it was very difficult to fill with other positive spiritual influences. Now, the influence that the Jesuits had had been gained through their work in education in Mexico and in healthcare and in the evangelization of a large part of Mexico over the years. In the 1950s, however, the church's relationship with the state began to deteriorate. Consequently, church property was now confiscated by the state. The churches remained open, but the religious orders were expelled. This was not the first time, as we've seen, that the religious orders were kicked out. Religious vows were now declared to be illegal in Mexico. Marriage ceremonies and cemeteries were all secularized, and the government now allowed Protestants to enter the country. During the 1860s, the liberal Juarez government encouraged a religious revolution by supporting the concept of an independent national church and by encouraging religious pluralism in the form of Protestant missionaries and non-Catholic groups. Between 1876 and 1911, the church's relations with the Mexican government returned to a more normal position. In 1911, however, tensions broke out again. And in 1917, the government enacted a new and liberal constitution, which included a number of harsh restrictions on the Catholic Church and its clergy. The church was now prohibited from owning or administering property. All church property held through third parties, such as schools and hospitals, was nationalized. The clergy were barred from voting, from holding public office, or from speaking out on public affairs. Government assistance to the church was prohibited. Education was secularized. Monastic vows and all religious orders were outlawed. Public worship outside the church was prohibited. During the 1920s, these relations deteriorated still further. The government now expelled all foreign clergy, including missionaries. It also limited the number of priests in the country, while those who remained were required to register with the government. These tense relations between church and state continued until the 1940s, when the atmosphere once again began to change. Today, relations are fairly normal. There is still considerable popular suspicion of the Catholic Church and its ambitions among a portion of the Mexican population. A recent census revealed that approximately 78% of the population of Mexico was Roman Catholic, and about 11% were Protestants. As in elsewhere in Latin America, Pentecostalism has been growing at a rapid rate. Remarkably, strong indigenous traditions also remain, especially in rural areas. These are often combined in a form of syncretism with Roman Catholicism. So you'll get the Roman Catholic Church, but you'll also get worship of ancestors that existed in pre-Christian times in Mexico, existing side by side, sometimes even in the same church. Since the time of colonialism, the Catholic Church has been closely identified with the interest of the wealthy and powerful throughout much of Latin America. Though ministering extensively to the poor and dispossessed, the Church had all too often failed to fight for their interest or to defend them against various governmental injustices. Consequently, the vast majority of the population throughout Latin America has languished in poverty, with little opportunity for social or economic advancement, or even little hope for improving their lives this side of the grave. Liberation theology emerged in the Catholic Church in Latin America during the 1950s and 60s as a means of challenging this traditional order of things. It is often identified with a handful of Catholic theologians, such as Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru and Leonardo Boff in Brazil, among others. Another famous exponent of a more conservative form of liberation theology was Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was assassinated while celebrating Mass in his cathedral in March of 1980 by a right-wing death squad opposed to his and the Church's advocacy of the poor and the dispossessed throughout El Salvador. In simple terms, liberation theology emphasizes the need for institutional spiritual justice among the world's poor and dispossessed. In the name of Christ, it challenged the prevailing political, economic, and social structures of traditional societies, in which considerable portions of the nation's wealth, including its land, is concentrated in the hands of a small number of individuals, or families, or institutions. Some Catholics, especially Jesuits, saw liberation theology as a way to mobilize the poor, often mixing it with revolutionary thinking informed by Leninist or Maoist views of communal life. Land reform proposals also played a major role in their ideas, which of course directly challenged the large and wealthy landowners throughout much of Latin America. And people were organized into what were soon called base ecclesial communities. With this way of thinking, this theological movement soon became quite politicized, and the embers of frustration broke out into full-scale war, both within and without the Church. Because it directly challenges the often corrupt political and economic status quo, liberation theology has been highly controversial throughout Latin America, and even within the Roman Catholic Church itself, bringing it into direct confrontation with governments throughout the region, and transforming its long-held notions of church and state relations. Christianity remains the dominant religion throughout Latin America. Among the various expressions of Christianity, Roman Catholicism still retains the loyalty of a majority of the population, though again, this is changing. Even in officially secularist and former atheistic Cuba, Christianity is held by about half the population, with the majority of those being Roman Catholic. The other end of the spectrum may be occupied by Costa Rica, which is overwhelmingly Christian. Moreover, Roman Catholicism, practiced by about 70% of Costa Ricans, is, since 1949, the official state church of the nation, the only established church in all of the Western Hemisphere. The rise of Protestantism throughout Latin America, since especially the 1980s, has increased to about 15% of the population overall, with about 60 to 70% of all Protestants being Pentecostal. This growth of religious pluralism has also dramatically impacted church and state relations throughout the region. It has, in the first instance, challenged the claim that Catholicism is intrinsically part of Latin American religious, cultural, and political identity. It's required the state to grant greater accommodations to non-Catholic churches. And finally, it's helped transform many urban areas where Protestantism is strongest, as well as the rising middle classes.